Welcome to Grace Hill On Air. Today's podcast is sponsored by For Rent Media Solutions, the nation's leading apartment resource. Visit us online at forrent.com.
Welcome to today's episode of Grace Hill On Air. I'm Kara Rice. I'm delighted you can be here with us today. In honor of Fair Housing Month, we have invited a very special return guest to our podcast. And with us once again is our friend Nadeen Green. Nadeen, thanks for coming back to the show.
And thank you once again for having me. It's a privilege to be part of Grace Hill On Air. Thank you, Kara.
Listeners, I want to share a little bit of information about Nadeen as well as a brief legal disclaimer. Nadeen is the senior counsel for Rent Media Solutions and an expert on fair housing law. She's a regular speaker on the national circuit, and she's quite often the person that executives turn to when they need advice on their fair housing policies. In spite of her expertise, the information today, however, is not considered to be legal advice, so we do suggest that you discuss any questions or ideas that arise from today's podcast with your supervisor and your own legal counsel. Nadeen, as I mentioned a moment ago, April is Fair Housing Month in the United States, and of course we both like to see teams focused on fair housing all the year through. However, this time of year is certainly a good opportunity for us to kind of shine a spotlight on fair housing concerns. So I wanted to ask you, for teams that are interested in kind of turning up the heat on their fair housing efforts, do you have any advice for how on-site associates may be able to give themselves a fair housing checkup, so to speak?
Absolutely. I've got some ideas, but Kara, if I could, just before we start sharing that with the folks who are watching on Grace Hill On Air, I'd like to just talk for just a brief moment about why April is, in fact, Fair Housing Month. Although I will say that one time when I did one of the game shows that I do as one of my presentations, and that was one of the questions, one of the contestants actually answered with that our company every month is Fair Housing Month. And so they certainly got credit for the answer, even if it wasn't the one I was looking for. But I think what's important to understand is that we have the Fair Housing Act as a direct result of the assassination of Dr. King in April of 1968. He was assassinated on April 4th, and 1 week later, as a result of that assassination, on April 11th, we had for the first time nationwide in this country a law that started to protect people's civil rights and housing. And so sometimes people do say to me, why April? And it's not just randomly chosen. It's not one of 12. Let's pick one. It truly is in honor of Dr. King and the very first time that we had a federal law on housing to protect people in any aspect, including, of course, multifamily housing industry.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that, Nadeen.
Well, just a little teachable moment, a little bit of history, and now let's get into some practical information for your viewers, okay?
Excellent.
All right. You asked me to give you some general ideas about what folks could do, maybe sort of do a bit of a fair housing checkup using April as a sort of impetus, because there is absolutely much more awareness of fair housing in April because so many of the organizations promote the fair housing issues tied to the celebration of that. And so with that, I would like to say that the first thing to do, and for those who may see this podcast in its historical context at some point, and it could be in June or July for them, or September or December, but make a relationship with both your local fair housing folks and your local apartment association, because these are the resources that will let you know what the protections might be out there that can affect you on a day-to-day basis. Under the federal law, the one that is celebrated, of course, under the Fair Housing Month, we have 7 protections that belong to people. Apartment housing decisions can't be made based on a person's race or color, religion, national origin, their gender, or that they have children, or that they have disabilities. And those are in place for everybody. Nobody can have any less than those 7 considerations as they manage their way through multifamily housing. However, state and local governments, while they can't take away from those 7, very often do add to them. And so it's important for folks to know when they wake up in the morning and they are in any way going to be involved with an apartment community, whether they're an on-site person, a property manager with several things in their portfolio, a vice president with an entire region, an owner with multiple communities, wherever, they need to know that there can be different protections, and those different protections can mean that their policies, while they may be in compliance with the federal law, may not be in compliance with the state and local law. So probably the first thing to do with a checkup is to simply say, my community is located in this city, this town, within this state, and what might be the protections. And so reach out to the apartment association. Often they will know, or the attorney that does a lot of work for that association will know. And certainly reach out to the fair housing groups and say, we want to be doing it right. We understand this. Just want to know if there's any other protections that are out there or any that you see coming, because if we can prepare for some of them, that's good business as well.
Excellent. Thanks for reviewing those 7 federally protected classes. We have had those protected classes as long as I can remember.
Right.
I'm sure this is a question you probably get a lot. What's new? Are there any emerging areas of concern that our listeners should be aware of, Nadeen?
Yes, and there are, and what they are, of course, are the efforts at a state and local level to always be adding more and more protections. And some of the ones that we are seeing with a good bit of frequency is, of course, one is called source of income. And what source of income basically says is that as long as a person can demonstrate that they bring enough money to the table to pay the rent, you have to count that income. We tend to think always about, well, people, how much do they make at their job? But with fair housing, it may be everything from what do they have in terms of investments, what do they have in terms of Social Security payments, what do they have in terms of that they won a lottery and they took an annuity payout. But what mostly this impacts is that some things such as Section 8 in some areas of the country have been deemed to be a form of income. Somebody gives you a rent subsidy, and that should be included in the tally of the monies that you're bringing to the table to qualify on the rental qualifications. So source of income, it's not exactly new, but it continues to spread, and people need to understand that sometimes you can't say, no, we don't take Section 8, depending on the location of your community. Domestic violence is becoming a fair housing hot topic, and I'm seeing more and more states and cities starting to protect those who are victims of domestic violence, where under certain terms and conditions that person can escape a lease without any punishment for leaving early. That person can add extra locks to their doors under certain circumstances. That person can ask you to restrict the presence of certain people under a court order from coming to the property, even though they may be a leaseholder, that boyfriend, that husband, someone who has been, abusive, and I guess I should say, or that husband or girlfriend, because of course domestic violence can go both ways. We are seeing also the issue of criminal background. And very recently this has been looked at, and we're waiting for an opinion in the world of employment, because as you know, so many employers, including many in our industry, they look at criminal background in relation to hiring decisions. And quite frankly, many people in our industry look at felony convictions in terms of being able to, someone's being able to rent from a landlord. And so there is concern out there that because a predominantly skewed number of people in the Hispanic and Black community are representative in our criminal in our jails and prisons, that the impact on that group is severe, more so than for others, and therefore does it actually now need to be addressed as a civil rights issue, not only in employment, which is pending, but possibly in the future being looked at as an issue in housing as well. My recommendation to our industry, and I have been harping on this and blogging on this and writing on this for quite a while, is that I think it would be very wise for us as an industry to self-manage that better. Not all felony convictions make somebody a potentially bad resident. For example, Martha Stewart, she would not be able to rent from a lot of apartment communities today, even though she's not a risk to others. She certainly can afford the rent, and she certainly is going to take good care of the community and her unit. And so I think if we don't, as a business, look at criminal background and perhaps drill down to those type of felons that really do present issues for us, we may see government intervention because we maintain too broad a position on this. So that is one of those new things that is out there as well.
So you surprised me with that what's new. There actually is quite a bit that is new. So that's a great reminder, even if we think that we know everything about fair housing and we've been to seminar after seminar, it's always wise to kind of keep our ears open and our eyes open and be listening to what is happening out there.
Yes, and then I would like to recommend to folks that when you do have within your portfolio different protections, because you may have source of income where you have one community but it's not in effect in another, or you have domestic violence protection or domestic abuse protection in one area but not where one of your other communities are, still to run your company under one master program of policies and procedures where you act as if all of those protections are in fact in place everywhere. Because you don't want someone transferring from one community to another. You don't want a property manager to make a decision that would be fine at one community but not be appropriate at another. And so an umbrella approach, you can never get in trouble for giving people more rights than they have. You do, of course, get in fair housing trouble when you impact them in terms of denying them their rights under any protected class. So look at considering that as a way to manage through policies and procedures.
Okay, that's great advice. Thank you, Nadeen. And it certainly would be administratively easier to manage, I think, if you just have that umbrella policy from coast to coast.
Yes, both easier and certainly, I think, smarter.
All right, on the topic of what's new, I've got one more issue to ask you about. We've been hearing some rumblings that on the federal level, there's a possibility, some pending legislation to add one more protected class, and that is lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered individuals, which is referred to as LGBT. Can you tell me your thoughts on that, and should we at this point be training our teams to go ahead and treat that group as a protected class, do you think?
I'm always thinking that it's always good to be aware of what is out there and what the issues are, and whether we will see something in the immediate future relative to federal housing and federal civil rights protections. We are certainly seeing this more and more on the state and local level. And so there are cities out there that are added regularly to a list that is protecting the LGBT community. I think more than anything would be helping folks in our industry. And Kara, this might be an excellent segment for you to find a speaker on for Grace Hill on Air, is the etiquette and manners of dealing with someone, particularly in the transgendered community. Sometimes what can be perceived as discrimination in the sense of being unlawful is simply that the interaction was uncomfortable only because the person on the property management side, that leasing agent, that maintenance person, that person in the leasing office doesn't know how to be when they are around someone. When, for example, the person's photo ID shows them, but it shows them with the name of John, and they're using the name now of Jessica. And so how do you handle that? How do you work through that? And how do you just react to people who you may not have had an experience reacting with before? So are there practical issues? Yes, this is going to be something maybe not imminent, but it is certainly tracking on the state and local level. And will we see it more widespread? Yes, but I think it has a practical approach that needs to be given to, and I would love to see some programs in our industry that are based in how to interact appropriately with people, both from that kind of standpoint. How do you interact with people with disabilities? Do you shake hands with someone who has the prosthetic arm? Do you offer to shake hands? What about the person when you want to show them something upstairs and you think they can't walk upstairs? How do you work through these things, not just from a fair housing standpoint, but from making them feel comfortable? Because if they feel comfortable, they are much less likely to think that you don't want them there and raise the fair housing issues that can happen.
Really, really great points, Nadeen. I'm thinking, how wonderful would it be to have a discussion like this with two folks, one being yourself, the fair housing lady, as you refer to yourself sometimes, and then maybe we could also get someone to stand in as Miss Manners, and we could see where, fair housing and good etiquette intersect.
There are organizations out there for, as we were talking about just a little while ago, the LGBT community, maybe even invite someone to talk with us. Always remembering, though, that no person is always what their group identity might be, in the sense that, not all people who are blind feel this way about it and act this way about it. Not all people who have transgendered, react to, to others in the same way. So we can't just, stylize everybody and say, all Koreans this, all Baptists that, all transgendered, folks this, all people who use a wheelchair that, but at least come up with some things that would make everybody more comfortable, because I sometimes believe that what is perceived as discrimination, or not wanting somebody at a community, or not, handling their rental situation correctly, is not based on discrimination as it is based on the fact that, right or wrong, it is an awkward situation. And if we decide to look at it objectively and have dialogues with folks, I think that we could cross some bridges that would make everything better for everybody, not just the renters, but for the folks in property management and in our wonderful multifamily housing industry as well.
I'm sure you're right. Make it a lot more comfortable for us when we're properly prepared for those situations. All right,
absolutely.
Shift gears for just a moment. Can we talk about the Benjamins? Let us talk about fair housing and how it can hit operators in the wallet. Can you tell me of anything, maybe some recent cases that are a good illustration of why this is financially? It makes sense to be very cognizant and aware and on the right side of fair housing law at all times.
Right, and I've always had a mantra that I believe in fair housing and that it ought to be done right because it's the right thing to do. But the way the Fair Housing Act is structured is that even if you don't agree with it, believe in it, care about it, that it is really a good business practice to work toward compliance with all of the fair housing issues, because if not, the system is designed to cost you a lot of money. I can easily, you throw that question at me and I don't even have to go like, oh my gosh, where am I going to find something now to respond to Kara? Because I can tell you that there is, for example, $1 million settlement because a landlord would not give a woman with cerebral palsy a parking space that was closer to the door of her unit, failed to do a basic reasonable accommodation. I can tell you that I have seen white-only advertising cases where the real estate folks, continue to use only the traditional white person, in all due respect to you, lovely Miss Kara, I often refer to Barbie, the beautiful blonde, and that I've seen those kind of judgments be as high in jury verdicts as $2.1 million. I can share with you the fact that we have design and construction cases out there. A most recent one was with Spanos Properties, who, Mr. Spanos has communities all over the United States, and he ended up writing checks that totaled well over $7 million to resolve the issues at his communities, and that doesn't count the cost for a significant amount of retrofitting that he will be doing. And there was a sexual harassment case, and something that you may want to look forward to doing in terms of another Grace Hill on Air is to talk about the fair housing issues tied to sexual harassment, and particularly as they may relate to the maintenance staff, because now a settlement in a case for $1.67 million where a maintenance team had a pattern and practice of harassing the female residents. So there's a lot going on out there. I could argue that unfortunately Grace Hill on Air is not reaching the people that we wish it would, because the folks who really do make an effort to learn, stay aware of the issues in the industry, fair housing or any others, are not the people who will usually participate in the education. But for those who are willing to hear what is going on, you are a wonderful resource, and I think that knowing what's going on out there can be very, very helpful. It's good risk management.
I agree wholeheartedly. Nadeen, that is all the time that we have for today. I want to thank you so much for returning to our podcast and sharing all this great information, and also giving our listeners a lot to think about and a lot to talk with their supervisors and their coworkers about. Thanks for being here.
And thank you.
Listeners, that is our show for today. As always, we will post a recap of Nadeen's comments on the Grace Hill On Air blog, and you can find that, of course, at our website, which is at gracehill.com. I want to thank our sponsor for today. That's For Rent Media Solutions. They so graciously underwrote Nadeen's appearance here today, and we are so glad to have them as a part of our show. For Rent, of course, is a leader in social media marketing for our industry with exclusive opportunities such as Marketplace on Facebook. So we're glad to have them aboard. If you have feedback to share on this podcast, we are all ears. Go ahead and send it to me via email if you would, and that's to podcast@gracehill.com. Glad to have your participation. We'll look for you next time. See you soon.
Thanks for tuning in to Grace Hill On Air.